Tonight I am delighted to introduce D.T. Max to discuss his new collection of deeply personal interviews with the late Stephen Sondheim, conducted in the last year of the composer-lyricist's life. The book is entitled Finale, Late Conversations with Stephen Sondheim. Max will be in conversation with Adam Gopnik. Please look for all these books online at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. And of course, at the end of this evening, books will be sold in the lobby and will be signed by Max. D.T. Max is a staff writer for The New Yorker, is also the author of the best-selling Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace. I should say that Daniel worked on this Wallace biography as a Leon Levy Fellow in 2011-2012. Adam Gopnik, also a staff writer at The New Yorker, is the author of, most recently, 1,000 Small Sanities, Moral Adventures of Liberalism. Max and Gopnik will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions from our audience, both in person and online. Please click on the chat box at the bottom of your screens if you're at home to type in your questions. Our Associate Director, Thad Zilkowski, will be monitoring the online questions, and he will try to get to as many as he can. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. On that note, I now turn the evening over to Adam Gopnik. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Kai. Such a pleasure. First time we've ever met. And it is, believe it or not, the first time we have ever met, actually. When I joined The New Yorker 40 years ago, it was standard that you never knew anyone else who was working in the office. But in those days, it was because everyone stayed locked in their offices, brooding on their grievances or working on an unpublishable piece. And occasionally they would emerge like ghosts and wander. The reason we never meet anyone now is because there is no office.
Basically.
There is no office to go to.
Or less
so,
and less. Less and less of space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a pleasure to meet you. It's a
Likewise.
pleasure to be here under the auspices of the Leon Levy Center, where so many friends have, from Luke Manan to my brother Blake, have labored well. So it's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be talking about Finale, Late Conversation with Stephen Sondheim, which began, as I know you're going to explain, as a New Yorker project, ended stillborn, but we have this book in its place. And the joy of this book, if I may say, for anyone who knew Steve, is that Steve is back here on the page, and all of his orneriness and all of his brilliance and all of his amazing capacity for judgment and value of all the human beings I've ever known. Steve Sondheim was the single most opinionated human being I have ever known, and I have known many opinionated human beings.
Saying something.
But Dan, I know you've got something to read for us to start.
So this is an answer to the obligatory first question, which we all ask as interviewers, which is, how did you come to this project, and why did you choose to write about Stephen Sondheim? So I'm going to give you just a very boiled down version of the prelude to the book. And first of all, I also want to thank Shelby, Kai, and Thad, and of course Adam, who graciously made time from his budding movie career to do a real-life interview just to see how it's done in the analog world. So I always wanted to write about Stephen Sondheim. In fact, long before writing about him was even a possibility, I just wanted to meet Stephen Sondheim. In the spring of 1977, when I was 15, my mother went to a benefit for a theater called the Phoenix, and the event included a performance of Side by Side by Sondheim, which was a review of Sondheim's songs. She came home with a 2-record album of the show, and it was signed by Hal Prince, who was the artistic director of that theater in sort of thick magic marker, and then below that was Sondheim's signature, much, much more delicate, with the 2 S's like little treble clefs. So I'd never seen a signed book or album, and in fact, I didn't even know people did that, nor was I sure why. But on the album cover, Sondheim in profile glared off into space. Behind him hovered the logos for his many musicals, 9 amazing shows, and he was still then only in his mid-40s, and his imposing body language, sort of his arms crossed and his chin up, suggested that plenty more would be on the way soon. So my family lived in a large Upper West Side apartment, and my parents agreed on very little. And so, as a result, many of the rooms had almost no furniture. But we did have a gorgeous walnut-paneled KLH Model 20 Plus stereo that stood almost alone in the living room. Now, my father, a lawyer, would put on Dave Brubeck's Take 5, which was a favorite of his, and he'd put it on the record player, and I think some of us will be old enough to remember this. You could pull back the arm of the record player, and it would play endlessly. And that's exactly what my father did. Every once in a while, though, my mother, or it may in fact have been me, would put on one of the Sondheim records on the spindle and let it drop, and then it would fill its sound would fill the living room, spinning on top of this gyrating pile. So you'd have Brubeck underneath and one of the Sondheim albums. Now, I soon understood, as probably all of you have understood at some point because you're here, that Sondheim's witty, intricate songs were special. They were different. True, they weren't as singable and definitely not as whistleable as other songs, certainly not Take 5, which is one of the whistleable songs of all time. And his characters didn't sing to express overwhelming emotions or to resolve simple doubts the way most musical characters did. Instead, his characters were made of doubt, made of missteps, of ambivalence. Marry me a little, side by side by side. The complexity extended the music itself, which Sondheim filled with tricky rhythms and harmonic improbabilities, and anyone who tries to sing them, even on a shower basis, will immediately learn that they're very difficult. Several of the songs were from the musical Company, and even then I looked at this group of arch, insecure, promiscuous married couples and asked if that could possibly be what life was really like. Even in my mid-teens, I guessed it was. Sondheim's music captured perfectly the New York that I grew up in, with its graffiti-filled subways and pot-filled parties, its uncertain adults, and its adult children. So over the next 4 decades, I never got over my sense of having a special connection to Sondheim. And some reviewers have been like, yeah, you and 2 million other people, like Bud. But still, that's how I felt. I felt he was mine, and you felt he was yours, so that's fine. Then in late 2016, I saw his name on a list of possible profile subjects at The New Yorker. We don't see each other, but there is a list circulated of ideas that people have. So apparently the composer and lyricist had a new musical coming out based on 2 movies by the surrealist director Luis Buñuel. Now this sounded too good to be true. Buñuel was a director I loved, and then there was the Sondheim part. So now the opportunity was obviously incredibly appealing, but I wasn't sure how much fun it would be. To the extent I knew anything about Sondheim's public persona, his reputation was that of someone who guarded his privacy carefully, in fact so carefully that in 1998, when he was nearly 70, the fact that he had spoken candidly about being gay was treated as a kind of revelation. Now, to be sure, I could see why he would be mistrustful of the press. Even into the 1990s, many serious critics, including some who admired his aesthetic goals overall, had extremely mixed feelings about his work. And if you go back and read the reviews, you wonder when he became our composer-lyricist laureate. At what moment did they stop hammering on him and hoist him up above their shoulders? But in the end, of course, he outlasted his critics. A new generation grew up and they embraced his work without reserve. To them, everything before Sondheim in musical theater was dated, and those works created in their own time, if they were any good, owed an obvious debt to Sondheim. Here, for example, is Lin-Manuel Miranda just a couple of months after Sondheim's death in November 2021. He said, "Anyone who tells you that Sondheim isn't an influence on their music or their work is simply lying." But this was the end. The trip through the woods had surely taken its toll, and over time, Sondheim had developed a personality that was brassy and comic for the press. He was happy to talk, but he generally kept things impersonal. Still, it seemed worth a chance. So I wrote an email to his assistant to ask if the composer-lyricist would be willing to be profiled by me. Not long afterwards, Sondheim himself wrote me his straightforward response. "Dear Daniel, if I may," he wrote. Daniel is my actual name, the name that I had on the Upper West Side with my KLH. And he signed it, "Yours, Steve S." Yes, he would be happy to sit for a portrait if I was interested. Not that the note was without guile, and indeed I think I would have been quite disappointed if it had been. Example, he wrote that he was flattered to be asked. Now that just sounded ridiculous to me. I mean, given that he had by then won 8 Tonys and 8 Grammys, a Presidential Medal of Freedom, and had a Broadway theater named after him. It just seemed like a New Yorker profile probably would not have been necessary. And it actually turned out we'd already done one before, which had slipped the communal minds of the New Yorker, but there'd actually been an interesting one. Anyway, I sent him a copy of my biography of David Foster Wallace, which I published a few years before. He wrote back and he said that the first sentence reminded him of a first sentence that he had just read in a memoir in that week's New Yorker. He didn't say if he liked the first sentence. He didn't say if he got beyond the first sentence. But then he offered a date for us to meet, and I accepted. So apparently I had passed some sort of audition. Now, as I got ready for the interview, I realized that despite decades of admiring his work, I couldn't remember even the most basic things about him, and I had seen plenty. I did not know where he was born, where he grew up, how he began his career, who his friends were, where he lived. I didn't know what he looked like now that he was an old man, and I didn't know how he spoke. I didn't know if he composed on the piano or in the bathtub. I didn't know which of his musicals he loved best, or whether the words came first, or the music, though I did remember the joke in Merrily We Roll Along. I don't know if you remember this joke, where Franklin Shepard is asked, do the words come first or the music? And he answers, generally, the contract. I did not know if he had siblings or a partner in X, hobbies, pets, vacation, home secrets. You get the idea. I thought about my ignorance and asked myself, well, would this irritate him, as it would many people? But I didn't think so in his case. I would explain that there were 3 or 4 songs of his that were so familiar to me I couldn't remember when I'd first heard them. Those songs had changed my life. I wasn't trying to be a critic. I wasn't trying to be a maven. I was just one of his listeners. And one other thing I suspected was that Sondheim wasn't waiting for any critiques that I might have to offer. He would want to be in control of the discussion. The goal of that discussion would be to tutor me. I hoped I could push him just far enough out of his routines to get a fresh glimpse of who he was, but to do this, I wasn't going to try to impress him. It might be nice that he liked puzzles and rhymes, as I knew he did, but he had, I presumed, access to the best conversation, the most remarkable people on the planet. And again, these thoughts were just guesses, and doubtless they left a lot out. In the end, I would just try to have a conversation, much like 2 people who happen to sit next to each other on a flight and don't quickly come to wish it was shorter, or who are seated together at a wedding because the marrying couple thought they might have something, some small thing in common. I wanted what took place to be humble, unremarkable, non-interviewee, because he knew how to be interviewed. One thing I had in my favor was that he was old now. It might be a time of new openness for him. The Sondheim in my profile would in many ways be familiar, of course, because how could it not be? If you have anyone in your life who's in their 80s, I think you know that the same stories do tend to come out. But it was possible, too, that in this most reflective time of life, he might come out a bit more nuanced, a bit more complex, a bit more Sondheimian. So one day in January 2017, I stood in front of a series of low-connected houses in the East 40s. The word Masonette was going through my head. What were the possible rhymes? Red Corvette, Press Gazette, Raisonnette. It was January, but mild, and evening. Pink, sunset. I walked down a few stairs and rang an unmarked doorbell. Phone rings, door chimes, and in went me, directly into a living room like an old stage set. Thank you.
And from that beginning,
Yes,
it
now you
grew
know
from
how-
that little acorn, grew this small but mighty oak.
Yes.
It's so funny you tell that story, Dan, because my first exposure to Sondheim, similarly, was with Side by Side by Sondheim. In its first apparition, it's a wonderful review. You can now find it on Spotify, actually. It was organized by Ned Sherin with Julia McKenzie, Millicent Martin, and I had run away to London, and this is in 1977, with my
that's the year.
high school girlfriend, who is now my wife of that same period.
Complimentary.
And we ran away and we went to the London Theater, and I vaguely knew who Sondheim was, and we saw that show, and it changed my life because I'd never heard anything like it, or I said, that's what I'm going to do, which of course I never did. But I actually do.
So you saw it in London.
Saw it in London.
Camera on
It's a great.
Macintosh.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's great.
The thing about it is, as you say, and it's one of the really interesting things, and it comes up in this book, is that at that point, Steve had written only Little Night Music, Company, and so on. Sweeney Todd was just about to open, was not yet finished. Sunday in the Park, all of the things Into the Woods that we think of as prime Sondheim hadn't even been imagined, and yet he was already a dominant figure. Before we start talking about Sondheim, though, I'd love to talk to you about something that touches exactly on the Levy Center and so on, and that is about the art of the profile and writing a profile, something we've both done, particularly a New Yorker profile, which back in the day could run to be a full book in itself.
Yeah, right.
When Sam Berman wrote about Duveen or
What, they get 50,000 words?
yeah, oh, at minimum, absolutely. And one of the things that's interesting about this book is it's a very complicated transaction. The late Janet Malcolm said that it was a model of the Freudian betrayal, right?
Right.
And seduction and betrayal in every one. How do you approach it? I'll throw out one of the things I've come to do now, having done them for 40 years, sporadically, is that I say to everyone I'm approaching to profile, listen, before we start, you should know that there will be something in the piece that will hurt your feelings, offend you, and seem to you cruel and unfair. And I said, I have no idea what it will be that I say, but if you can accept that.
I don't.
But do you not find that to be true?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, so I think, so first of all, what this book is in a way, the raw material for half a profile. So I saw Sondheim 5 times over 3 years. And that's because actually what keeps happening is he keeps backing out of the profile. So even this first visit where I ring the doorbell, we have a great conversation, but what he's doing is kind of auditioning me for a profile I thought I'd already gotten the role for.
He's profiling you in the FBI sense of figuring out.
Exactly. And what we do is a kind of cultural geography where he's really testing to see, he's testing to see if I'm worth his time, I guess, or whatever, we like each other. But, it's so interesting. I have never agreed with Janet's rather bleak idea that anyone not, too dumb to know what's going on, I'm paraphrasing, knows that a profiler for the New Yorker is essentially a kind of confidence man who makes off with the money before, the victim knows what's happening. I believe, in this case with Sondheim, I think he got quite a bit out of it. And what I loved about this book, but also the interactions, is that Sondheim was a meta player. And he felt the transactional aspect of it was probably as fun as the non-transactional aspect. You don't usually get that. Most people, like Adam suggests, either they ignore the transactional aspect, which is you're going to get space in the New Yorker, which is, as your publicist will tell you, if you have a publicist worth, I don't know if you've ever heard this, that's worth a $500,000, if there's that dollar amount.
Really?
Yeah, because it's pages and
Really?
they see it as advertising. It's very disheartening. But he also saw the real connection, I think. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. I don't think if Sondheim's diaries if he wrote diaries, and I don't know if he did, and they come to light, I don't think you'll see in January 2017, the equivalent of the beginning of, Wuthering Heights. Or the positive version.
My life began when Dan Max ran my doorbell.
Solitary navel with whom I shall soon be troubled. I think he enjoyed my company. I think he enjoyed the games. He liked also, as we get to this, he liked putting me down from time to time. He was always super competitive. And there's one hilarious scene, I think, hilarious for me, when he and I are with Meryl Streep at the Penn Gala. And it's really like we're in high school, and he wants to make sure I don't get anywhere with her. And anytime I say something, he kind of puts in and I'm like, you're Stephen Sondheim. You don't have to do that anymore. You're one of the greats. But I liked that fact, and so had we gone on with this, had this become a full profile, I can imagine that the fact check, which is effectively where a fact check is far more than it appears to be really at the New Yorker. It's a kind of a chance to hear back for the subject some version of what they've said, and sometimes it's fine and sometimes it's not. But I think there would have been hard moments there, and I don't know what they would have been. You might know better than me. He was precise, but he's pretty precise in his first drafts. There's some people speak in sentences. Sondheim was that guy. And there were a few things he said were off the record that aren't in the book. They weren't amazing. He probably said them other places and forgot to say off the record, and so they're on the record other places. But he didn't want him in, and I felt like if I was going to do what I wanted to do with him, which is really draw him fully into conversation, really conversation was my goal, then I had to, give him that. I like your approach. Does it actually make it any better, or is it, you know?
It makes it better for you in as much as when the inevitable moment happens, you can say, I told you so.
Yeah,
You know, it's sort of, I told you, you know, it's like the scorpion, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
told
right.
you,
It's
you know.
my nature. But, you know, it does remind me, like, this beginning where I say how little I knew or refreshed myself. You know, most of the information that I laid out in that rather long paragraph, you could get off the internet really as you walked down, you know, whatever, 49th Street, whatever street you lived on. Like, it's easily achievable. But I mean, what I would be interested if you feel this way and if you proceed this way, but I find that if you come to someone like Sondheim knowing a great deal, and it was just a guess on my part, let's say, you know, because I know a lot more now, if I had to say, you know, wow, I can't believe, you know, you're the composer of Saturday Night, and, you know, it had the two Epsteins writing it, and then it you know, you never put it on because, you know, the lead producer, I think he had a heart attack or something, you know. I think that then Sondheim would go, yeah, oh, you know a lot about me, which is not a great opening. And it also totally strips away what he thinks about it. So then you have to push the person again, you know, or urge them again, well, what did you think about that? Which is one of the you know, so that's there is a little bit of tradecraft, but not only. It's also so that I don't think you can, like Adam and I were discussing, should we chat beforehand? And, you know, you can't really fake knowing something for the first time. And maybe some people can. I'm sure Meryl Streep can, but I needed to learn it from him, I felt, to get to make him know that I was there not as a time server, but as a guy who didn't want to be anywhere else in the world, which was true.
No, I think both things, I mean, to the first point, I do think it's true about every profile that one writes, that whether you intend it as a bear hug and it will be taken as a betrayal, or you intend it as a betrayal and it will be taken as a bear hug. And I wrote a profile of the wonderful and still dear friend Alice Waters, the great American chef. She came to Paris once intending to explore the idea of opening a restaurant. And Alice is the most utterly sincere, irony-free human being I've ever met. And her trying to manage in a French world in which no one is ever sincere and everything is tinged with irony was inherently comic. And I wrote it, it was completely accurate, but I thought, oh, I hope Alice isn't stung by this. She wasn't at all, because that's who she is. You know, I mean, if she had a sense of irony, she would not be who she was. I suspect with Steve, it's partly too that you got him at a certain moment, and that was in the midst of still the end of Bounce, the road show, I guess, as it was called, at the end, when he was feeling, and it's one of the things that's true of every human being, and it comes through in this book, Dan, is that everyone's life viewed from inside feels like a tragedy and a series of failures. And it's interesting about Sondheim, who seems a model of he wrote a song himself, mocking himself, called God, about how he was taken. But that last show of his was a failure, and he was working at that time on the show with David Ives from the Buñuel films, which interestingly he actually had announced at a New Yorker Festival conversation that we did together, that I did with him.
It's worth watching when Adam gently extracts, you know, from the mouth, almost like that angler, that deep sea angler fish, you know, with the thing. And Sondheim goes, well, I could say it. And he was in a good mood. Yeah. He was in a good mood that day. What I was going to say is, I also think it's true, and it's another interesting thing about this, that any profile or any book has a narrative of its own. And I think Steve was, by that point in his life, was fed up with the degree of sort of encyclopedic knowledge that 20-somethings had about his work. And he didn't find it flattering. He found it stultifying. He found it was a form of living death to have people coming up to him and saying, I love all the cut songs from the second act of Follies, and I have them. I know.
And so, and so in a sense, the story you were going to tell was, here's a guy I admire greatly without knowing well, and now I'm going to go through his presence.
I was trying to think, you know, I have done a lot of interviewing over the years. I think Sondheim was close to, or may have been the most famous person I interviewed, but not vastly beyond, say, I don't know, Saul Bellow, who I interviewed once, or some high political figures. But I felt with him, what I felt was that he So you have to look at a person and ask, who is this person? So, I didn't know when I started that the Buñuel wasn't going well.
Yeah.
I mean, so that's first of all, I didn't go in to see a problem.
Just to set it, he was
Yeah,
writing
sorry.
a show based on two Buñuel films with the wonderful playwright David Ives.
Yeah, and
it's a great idea, and
Great idea.
and they advanced to a workshop with,
Yeah.
and then something happened, and
Yeah, I mean,
David quit.
so if you think about also, it's such a great idea that if you think about the basic criticism that people have leveled at Sondheim, the later Sondheim or some of his shows is, the first act and the second act don't really relate to each other. So here was, the first act was going to be based on the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie, and the second act based on Exterminating Angels. So he had structured it so that no critic could complain because they're two different movies that just kind of allude or play in the same area in a way. So fairly early on, he's happy with the show, but I think that's a little bit of self-presentation. I mean, like any creative person, and he and I joke about this at one point, when he's writing well that day, it's sunny out, and when he's writing poorly, for Sondheim, who was so gifted and at one point could write songs so fast, I didn't actually know what the internal life was like, but I do know something about the external life because he talked to me about it at one point. So the first interview, I'm in New York at that townhouse. Then we go to this, he fires me after, then I go to this Penn event, he fires me after, then I go to Connecticut.
His place in Connecticut.
Yeah, I think eventually I go to his place in Connecticut. And there, he says to me, he says he didn't write well that morning. And when we talk about this Janet Malcolm thing, like one of the things that I'm proudest about in this book, which only I would probably notice, is that when he seems to despair, I try to buck him up. In other words, that's not really an interviewer's job. Like, you're really probably supposed to watch them weep, I guess, and get the moment. But this is like a guy who means as much to me as anyone I don't really know on the planet, right? And who is suffering a kind of creative crisis in slow motion, I guess, probably. And so and I say to him, oh, come on. He says, I didn't write well today. Here we are up at his country house, which is, I think, did you ever go up there?
No, I never was.
So, it was a little bit like off stage compared to...
It's Turtle Bay, too.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, it was appropriately enough the out-of-town run. So, and I said to him, oh, I'm sure if you were doing, if it goes well tomorrow, you'll be like, everything's great. And he laughed and appreciated, I think, what had been an unusual moment for him and a slightly daring moment for me. But so then he got into the point, and this I thought was interesting. He said it wasn't about the work of that day. He said basically that he felt out of date. And when you think about it, he said, he brought up his father, who's a kind of, I would say, ambivalent figure for him, far more positive than his mother, who there's no son.
Who he vilified,
Who he vilified, the minute I walked in and the minute anyone else walked in. I mean, his hatred for his mother was so fresh when I interviewed him that, like, if she had walked in through the same door I did, he'd have, like, taken one of those, like, wine glasses he had and just thrown it at her head. I mean, it was totally fresh. But his father was a more nuanced figure. His father used to sit with him and pick out piano tunes. This is all according to Sondheim. I mean, and he's told us other places. And so they would have these moments together. They'd go to baseball games together. But his father and mother split up, and then his mother became, had that kind of relationship. And we only have this from Sondheim's side, but like, she was, as he said to me almost immediately, a star f***er, which he said with great glee, pausing a moment to underscore it rather than to retract it. But anyway, he said that his father had loved to listen to Victor Herbert. And he mentioned someone else. I forget,
Frimmel, I think he's...
Yeah.
Frimmel, right, he says Frimmel.
Right, well, I didn't even know who that was. Herbert I knew. I mean, I don't think I'd ever seen...
Right.
What is it, Babes in Toyland, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, Naughty Mary, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but basically the point was, he said, now I'm old-fashioned shit. And I said to him, again, and I think, Adam, you'll recognize this as kind of a dare, I said to him, after pausing and considering how much I enjoyed my relationship with him, and that it might end immediately, I said to him, but genius is never old-fashioned, right? Which is a kind of a strange thing to say, right? A little bit... I'm like,
Yeah, reassuring. It's I'll take it. It's reassuring.
Yeah,
right?
it's reassuring to some, and to others, it's crossing just from where I wasn't to where I didn't want to be. But anyway, he paused for a moment, and he said, thank you for the word, and he did a kind of salaaming gesture. And then he got to the point, which was what he thought, I think what he really thought, which is he said, you know, great geniuses, true geniuses do not get old-fashioned.
Picasso, he quotes, cites Picasso, Stravinsky.
Stravinsky and who's the third? Gershwin, interestingly
Right,
enough.
yeah.
Gershwin, and so, and he said they're able to adjust to the times.
Yes, he mentions Gershwin, and it's interesting.
Yeah, he
it's
mentions
curious that he
Gershwin.
does.
He died
'cause
at 39.
I was going to say Gershwin never had the chance or the opportunity to adjust to anything.
I know. I think what he may have meant by that, because it's a kind of a two-part statement he makes to me,
Right.
I think he's emphasizing how Gershwin could take jazz
Right.
and non-show tunes and bring them into his work.
Yes, it's interesting because he loved Porgy and Bess, which
Yeah.
has become somewhat unfashionable to love,
Right,
but he
loved
loved
that.
He loved it. Loved it
Was that
completely.
was that Gershwin for him? Was basically Porgy and Bess? Because I know he didn't like Ira Gershwin's lyrics.
No, he didn't like anybody's lyrics very actually.
Well, he did like the Porgy and Bess lyrics. the
He
one-
DuBose Hayward's
Yeah,
lyrics, which
yeah.
was a strange choice. The lyrics that he admires are DuBose Hayward and Richard Wilbur's,
Yeah.
genuinely great lyrics for Candide.
Candide, oh,
But
yeah.
you notice both of those people are not competitors,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
They're both visitors from another planet,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Rather than actual
Right.
working lyricists.
Interesting.
So
point.
it's
you didn't have to see them at the Tonys year after year.
yeah, they're not, or even in the Tonys in your mind, the
Right,
phantom Tonys of the past.
Yeah,
they're not.
yeah.
They're not competitive. I say this with nothing but admiration, but Steve was a very competitive guy.
He was very competitive. Yeah.
I also think it's something else that comes up in terms of his unhappiness. Some of it, obviously, related to is you only feel as good as your most recent project.
Yeah.
But it's something, and it comes up circuitously in your conversations, I think, Dan, and that is that though we see Sondheim as being this extraordinary meteoric figure who, by his mid-40s, was clearly the dominant figure in his world. In the eulogy I wrote from the New Yorker, I compared him to Balanchine because he had that kind of presence. You couldn't ignore him even if you didn't. Even if you didn't love him, and most people did love him and couldn't ignore him. He was that kind of figure. But in his circle, I learned sort of marginally, he was a late arriver. And so the people in that extraordinary circle of the Leonard Bernstein circle, basically, of Leonard and Felicia and all of the people around them, Steve, someone who knew them both very well said to me years later, whoever would have known that Steve would be Mozart and Lenny would be Salieri? We thought it was the other way around.
That's a great line.
And I think he internalized that to some degree. He was always internally the sidekick who wasn't allowed to write music in West Side Story. And
He certainly resented. I
Yes.
mean, one of the funny things that I learned about him that I didn't know is that he actually had quite a privileged upbringing. And it was, in a way, a strangely modern upbringing. I mean, his parents, his father was a high-level dressmaker, and sold to Bergdorf and all these stores.
not to interrupt, but isn't it fascinating? I was reading that so many of the major artists of that generation, and beyond, J.D. Salinger, Richard Avedon, Deanne Arbus, Steve Sondheim, were all the children of the garment business.
Well, I think I just did an interview with the Forward this afternoon where we explored that from a non-professional point of view. I mean, I think there were, that was the generation of Jewish immigrants, and that was one of the jobs, and then their kids, moved more into the mainstream. But he was so privileged that there are these stories that you don't really, I mean, so in this era where we know that, this unequal era where the children of the well-connected get the internships and so on and so forth, like he was that kid, but in the 50s. So he's, how old is he? He plays chess with Humphrey Bogart.
Right. On Beat the Devil.
On Beat the Devil. He's immediately, through his mother of all people, whom he's so mean about, he gets his first job after college is some gig on, Playhouse 40, I forget,
Right.
one of those prestigious golden age of television. So he never has a moment, he never shares the cold water walk up with three other people, at least not metaphorically, and I don't think literally, but don't really know. And so that's funny. I think it changes. I assumed when I went to see him for the first time that was his background, and I also assumed with absolute certainty that he wasn't from New York because of the E.B. White, dictum or idea that, you know, it's the people from outside New York who come into the city and make it their own, and nobody made it more their own than Sondheim, who would bicycle, back in the day, he would bicycle from his townhouse to Times Square for rehearsals, you know, and I mean, the beautiful songs in Company,
right.
you know, another 100 people get off of the, I mean, those seem so perfect for the person who comes in. So it was quite surprising to me. And now you could say, well, he always felt like an outsider. I don't know, but he was an insider. I mean, he was that kid. So it relates to what you say. So I wonder if by the time he gets to, you know, Bernstein and that crowd, he's never been, you know, so to say, second fiddle. And he doesn't like it because he has no, he, you know, wasn't in the military, although he did go to a funny military school where he claimed he liked to polish the brass. I don't know. You know, I wonder if there's anything to that. It was just such a shock to him.
I think it just was a hugely competitive circle, and the Bernstein circle, and they spent unimaginable amounts of time by our own degraded standards amusing each other, making movies, putting on satiric plays, organizing huge birthday parties where people would be like, and it's a wonderful and enviable part of it, but it was a hugely competitive circle in which Steve was, at that point, Sondheim was not the...
Just because you'll know this, and I won't, what did Bernstein say about Sondheim in any moment?
Well, I don't know what Bernstein said directly, but certainly inferentially, he admired and appreciated him, certainly, but like every composer I've ever known, he thought he was a natural lyricist. He thought he was as good a lyricist as Steve was, and he wrote, by his own account, he wrote lyrics for West Side Story and did it.
And so he never muttered about, you know, nurturing the serpent at his breast or whatever?
I don't think so. I think I don't know of it, of anything of that kind. But, you know, the broader lesson is, you know, Mary Rogers has just published...
miraculously.
A book of memoirs, or has been published on her behalf with Jesse Green, a hugely entertaining book. Yeah. And there again, Mary Rogers is a child of privilege, but didn't feel that way. She felt, in fact, that the privilege of being Richard Rogers' daughter was nothing but an impediment to her.
But that to me...
And was Steve Sondheim's best friend. It's that beautiful song, Opening Doors, in Merrily, that's about, they say, I'm the guy he didn't want to talk to, the guy who knows that... But
I didn't mean to interrupt, but what I was going to say is like, but Mary's story feels modern to me, which is, you know, poor little rich girl's story. And I'm not minimizing it, but you know, all the dysfunctionality in her life would not surprise you for a child of privilege. You know, so Sondheim's not quite the same thing. I mean, Sondheim doesn't come from a family that's that well connected, you know, but he comes from a family where his mother's ambitious, his father's ambitious. He goes to ethical culture school. He kind of they somehow join the kind of Jewish haute bourgeoisie.
Upper middle class.
Yeah, which is, I mean, also I was a little surprised that nobody said, you're not, you know, no, you know, not at Temple Emmanuel, my friend, you know, not San Remo, but maybe the culture was more fluid then, or...
But it was a secure, prosperous, not fashionable, upper middle class culture. I was talking to him once about West Side Story, because he always, as everyone knows, hated his own work in West Side Story, which he actually kind of hated the whole show, because he thought it was completely phony, and there was Lenny and Jerry Robbins and him writing about Puerto Rican gangs on the west side. He hated
the lyrics to I Feel Pretty.
He hated all of his life. And I said, oh, you mean you should have been writing Upper West Side Story? And he said, yes. He said, that was what I always felt
That's clever. That's very
out
good.
of place.
Wasn't it originally called East Side Story?
Yes, exactly. And then the East Side got too expensive, and by the time they were ready. Something I wanted to talk to you about, though, because it's one of the really wonderful things in the book, is how you got Steve talking about the mechanics of music. Because you're a bit of a musician yourself, and you know the basics enough to talk. Because I think that may be a too easily forgotten side of Steve's genius, to use that word, is what an extraordinary composer he was.
Absolutely.
And as soon as you get him on that subject, he opens up in a very natural and moving way, just talking about writing from A major to A flat, and from A major to its relative minor, and so on.
No, it's a good point. Like, well, because books tend to gather word people, we tend in gatherings like this to talk a lot about his lyrics.
Yes.
And the music, because I don't know how many singers there are in this room, but I'm not one. You know, we know on a generalized basis that the songs are hard to sing, but I said to him, because I like kind of geeky talk, and I thought he would too. Like, how do you actually, what are you actually doing here? What are you working for, and what is the technique? So he was, as he would tell everybody, trained. And I think one thing that was interesting about Sondheim is that he distinguished between himself as a trained composer, that is, somebody who took musicology and studied the way that the tonics
with Milton Babbitt, a great
figure,
figure of 20th century American music.
Yeah, and
of avant-garde American music.
Right.
Yeah.
And he used that a little bit as his calling card, I think, although he didn't need it if you ask me, but he used it a little bit as calling card. I'm not, I'm not Julie Stein, you know what I mean? I'm somebody who's got professional credentials, and you're going to be impressed with me even in a graduate center. But he told me, he explained how he was modulating, I forget the exact details, but he was modulating from one key to another in this Buñuel musical. And I actually saw the music on his piano bench, and with his permission, I took permission, and eventually I brought it home and asked a more capable musician than me to play it, so I actually heard it. And then I said to him, and so I think one of my favorite exchanges, I said, I said to him, is that how you bring out emotion? And he said something to me like, he said, Bob, you don't get emotion with just one modulation.
Yes, that's...
all you get there is a. So anyway, the point is, he was thinking intellectually. I mean, and one thing I wanted to bring up is curious.
Yeah, he said, excuse me, oh, come on, you don't get real emotional implications from just a modulation.
I know.
It's a surprise.
It's a surprise.
And then you say to him, I just didn't know you talked this way. And he says, it's just as you say, I talk to myself this way. I am a trained musician. I've always been interested in what Milton Babbitt calls tonicization and so on.
Yeah. And tonicization was a word that through the, part of this ran on the New Yorker website, and everyone was trying to figure out what tonicization was, because it's sort of modulation, but he insisted it was different, and Milton Babbitt insisted it was different. And again, I mean, that's what our phones are for, but there is a small difference, and it was important to Sondheim, I think, to say tonicization, and he said it very deliberately.
Well, he gives an example, which I thought was amazing to me, at least, is the Too Many Mornings. That beautiful and deeply moving song in Follies begins in A and ends in F, and no one is ever aware of it. In other words, you don't hear it as a modulation at all, even though, in fact, it's a tonicization. It ends in a totally different tonic.
Yeah, no, I mean, and he did that over and over. I think there you do get emotion.
Yeah.
There's enough modulation, you get emotion. Just going back to the Bernstein thing, because it's so interesting to me. He did a dig at Bernstein too in my interview with him, and it was he was talking in this, I think, key moment about being out of date, and he brought up two people who had tried to correct this in their own work. So he brought up Bernstein's Mass.
Yes.
And then it's the Julie Stein. Is there a Hallelujah? Is that
It was Stein's attempt at a black show.
And he paused for a minute.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, and I could see he was getting naughty. And he quoted a friend. I can't remember if he named the friend. It was one of those friends who conveniently exist for us to quote in such moments. Reminding me of David Foster Wallace, who in a famous essay said that about Updike, that he was just a penis with a thesaurus, and then attributed it to a friend who has never yet surfaced. But anyway, he said a friend had used the phrase, and he paused for a moment, and he said, alluding to this attempt to be modern as Rip Van With It.
Yes.
So that was his way.
Bernstein's Mass, which he collaborated on with Stephen Schwartz.
And then, I looked around, and I thought that I had this wonderful pearl of glistening evil from Sondheim, but actually he had one other time not been able to resist, when all the stars had lined up. But I mean, he was frightened of that. I think it speaks to a number of things. One, his dignity, which was very important to him, I think. Yes. Wouldn't you say? I mean, he
absolutely.
Although he wasn't, it's peculiar, to be with him, at least for me, was he was able to be your peer, not when someone would say, are you peers? He probably couldn't have withstood that. But he was interested in other people in a non-false way, and not just, I think, personally to acquire material. I just think he was a person who was at the same time our most brilliant composer-lyricist, and also just the guy was curious about stuff.
This sounds a bit crazy, but I always had the impression that though he was the presiding genius in the field that he had mastered and conquered, he always said, had he not met Oscar Hammerstein, as a boy had not been rescued by Oscar Hammerstein, he would never have been a composer or lyricist.
He would have been a mathematician.
He would have been, and I always had the sense that, though that sounds like one of those things that artists say and you ignore, I always had the sense that that was true. He was a great natural teacher. He reminded me much more of someone who was a great natural teacher, who would have loved to have done that, than somebody, there was no showbiz about him in that way, which was unusual for...
and confusing too, I think, because, in some ways he was utterly and self-declaredly a showbiz guy. I mean, nothing made him happier with me than talking about shows that had flopped. I remember, we talked about Hair. So I was one of the reasons I got fired, or maybe more accurately, laid off temporarily, was because I brought up Andrew Lloyd Webber and his work. And everybody who knows Sondheim, who's read the book, is like, why would you do that?
Why would you even mention that name?
But interestingly, he does once talk about it with Frank Rich in an interview. So I didn't know that. But before we got to that, I brought up Hair. And I didn't think Sondheim would like Hair, but it is interesting that Sondheim is growing into his greatness at the same time as rock music is being born, right? And it's kind of odd because there is a sort of a light rock introduction in Company, which I adore, but that's not really, I can't remember him doing it again. Maybe I just don't know.
He just was never turned, it was odd for those of us who grew up taking he recognized the brilliance of the Beatles, to use the right word there, but it never stirred him or moved him. But it is a fascinating thing that, every artist has to define their own domain. And he chose to define his domain in a way that was necessarily conservative in a certain sense,
very much so.
in his rejection of slant rhyme, his rejection of rock music, but that was essential for him. Just one last thought that came to me reading this, he loved 19th century classical concert music. Yeah. That was his passion. And if you think about it, his 4 greatest shows are all set in the 19th century. Sweeney Todd, Sunday in the Park with George, A Little Night Music, and Into the Woods are all 19th century European shows. We should get some questions from outside.
This is from Zoom.
We're having such a good time here that it's hard to stop.
This is from Zoom. Zoom question. Did he discuss writing Send in the Clowns in one night when he was told on the road that the show needed a song at that moment?
I'm trying to remember, that was such a chestnut of his that I may not have covered that with him because it was sort of so well known. He did discuss, and I thought it was kind of fun, the 2 songs that he wrote for Funny Thing Happened on the way to the Forum. I can't remember if he writes them on successive nights, but basically he did a very, I thought, brilliant analysis. He was very focused on the idea that the music and the show, the book and the music and lyrics you write have to go together. And his point was that before he wrote, the famous opening of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, anyway, that he would, that the show mismatched, the music mismatched, the burlesque of the book mismatched the elegance of the music. And he had to find a way to bring it all together, and that he wrote in a night.
Yeah, it's a famous musical theater story. It was the song was called "Love Is in the Air." Yeah. That everyone, it's a beautiful song, a wonderful song. John Candor was talking about it the other day, loved it, and it was wrong for the opening of the show. And overnight he wrote. Right.
But my memory from what he told me, now I may be wrong, is I think he writes "Love Is in the Air" first to solve the problem. So he actually writes 2 songs to solve the problem.
I don't think so, but could we? Maybe he would know better than I.
But I may have that wrong.
Than I do.
So that was the story that he chose to go into. There were certain things that were so well known that even I, despite my prelude, knew kind of to avoid.
That's part of but don't you think that's part of the art of the profile, is exactly that you don't want to bore either your subject or your reader by asking the question that they've been asked a million times.
Although if he'll come to it on his own, I don't think I said to him, is there any musical you can remember where you wrote a new song at the last minute? I think it came out of a discussion of when the lyrics and the music don't match the book, which for him was a more interesting point of entry.
One of the great profile writers at the New Yorker, Alec Wilkinson, I know did a profile of Paul Simon, and he never mentioned Art Garfunkel, asked him anything about it, and so until the very end, after they had already established a rapport, because it's the last thing that Paul Simon wants to talk about. And if you ask him that question, you seem like an idiot, right?
Well, maybe that was my Andrew Lloyd Webber. But you know, the truth is, and here's where it gets interesting, I think, with Andrew Lloyd Webber, I actually wanted a complicated answer. I wanted Sondheim to say something like, because we were in our nerd talk at that point, I wanted him to say, you know, the way that Sir Andrew, he would say with irony, you know, handles the modulated third, you know, 15 minutes into Sunset Boulevard was something that I don't much like his work overall, but this, I really thought there's something there, and I used it in something. That's what I wanted. So you who knew Sondheim realized so that's worse than just wanting him to crap on Webber. Like when he writes me one of the many breakup notes, he writes, you know, you were looking for something marketable about, you know, in our interchange. And actually, I don't think he believed that, because I think he knew the world well enough to know that a fight between him and Andrew Lloyd Webber was not, you know, New York Post level stuff.
Well, I do think it's true, as you said yourself, Dan, he was acutely sensitive to the meta levels of the interchange. And he's trying to suss you out to say, what's this guy's actual game? I know what my real game is, what's his real game?
But I mean, we've been together so long, but it's worse than that, because by asking him seriously if he learned anything from Webber, I had actually stepped from one pot of poo to a much deeper one, because that was the thing that, you know, and if you notice, he comes back to that. And he says, I don't really think I learned anything from anyone. And that was the moment when I understood that despite all of our enjoyable interaction, there was some part of him that understood that he had remade the musical and nobody even came close, you know?
Yeah. Lady here.
Did you have the sense that he took joy in what he created? He talked a lot about artistry and solving puzzles, working hard, that being part of the ensemble creative. That's not about joy.
So the question is, did Sondheim take joy? Did I get the sense he took joy in what he created? I mean, I think that's a good question. I once sent him a picture of my daughter in West Side Story. My daughter was 11 at the time. And I was sending it for him to make some goofy comments about, you know, the amateur scenery or whatever. And he wrote back and said he was deeply moved. So I think he took pleasure, deep pleasure in the idea that people would perform his work. And in a funny way, for whatever reason, I feel that was more important to him than that they would survive either in concert halls or as piano standards. He was a showbiz guy, and I think he loved that the stuff was being performed. Now remember, he was also in an a difficult creative moment. So it may be that wasn't the moment for him to remember how easily, you know, the songs in Company, you know that line from The Inferno, there's no greater agony than to remember pleasure in the midst of misery, you know, anyways, that was what I thought of when I was talking to him. I
think an artist's life is most often remembering misery in the midst of pleasure. Right? The only thing I'd add to that is my own sense, and again, I was hardly intimate with him, but over several conversations, is that he was a man of the theater. I think Dan is saying that. And it's fascinating because Oscar Hammerstein, who was his great mentor, father figure for him, was also a man of the theater. And when a show worked, that was where the joy was. It wasn't in the writing, and it certainly wasn't in the songs. It was in the sense that the show had worked. I know that a good friend, Raul Esparza, one of the great Sondheim interpreters of our time, did a version of his last show, Bounce, whatever it was finally called, Roadshow in the final version, at City Center. And it worked. And he wrote to Raul saying, I've never felt more happy because finally the show worked. He put it more elegantly than that. And I think that just as Hammerstein cared not about the songs, but about the show working, I think that was one of the things that Sondheim inherited. And if the show worked, that was where the joy resided. Yes, gentleman here.
Yeah, I was just wondering about what his feelings about, sort of like the magic of music was to him.
I'll repeat the question. Right?
What?
This gentleman here couldn't hear you, and I said I would repeat the question.
That's all.
Yeah.
What was his feeling about what was the magic of like music to him, and where did he have any way of, where the melody might have come out, where he went or how it came?
So the question is about his relationship to music. Where was the magic of music to him? How did he invent melody, and how did he? Right.
You know, I mean, a couple of things that I found out not from him, but later that were kind of amusing was that he liked to compose the first drafts of his music high, and then he would always do the edits sober. I can't remember if it was the music and the lyrics or just the music, and you know, he was very interesting about the whole question about kind of creativity. And it seemed to me that the answer, at least as he told it to me, was it could come from a number of places. Like sometimes he would just, he would deeply infuse himself with the book. Now we almost never think about the book of a musical. It's one of the kind of it's like being a dramaturg or something. It's like, what exactly do you do when you create the book for a musical? When you create a book in our world, you create the thing. But a book for a musical is the story. And very few of us could really tell you what the story is of Into the Woods or, well, there's two stories really, but you know what I mean. But he said that was his point of departure on almost everything. And it comes back to this idea that the music and the lyrics have to go with the book. And so he would say, for instance, that sometimes he would just look at a line of dialogue because there's dialogue in the book. It's actually, I guess, often it take different forms, but it's basically the play on which you then build the musical. And he would sometimes just hear a cadence in some words, and then he would use that to write a song. Like even, you know, he would just pull that out, like just something that his book writer had written, not thinking of it as a lyric.
Dan, it is a pleasure meeting you at last. I'm glad we have the water fountain between us at last. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you.